Welcome. I am Renee Fry-McKibben, Professor of Economics at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University and co-director of the COVID-19 and the Macroeconomy Research Program at CAMA with Joaquim Vespignani. We're excited to have you join us for this panel webinar with Barbara Bruckner from the Climate Policy Initiative, Frank Yotzo from the ANU, and Adele Morris from the Climate and Energy Economics at the Brookings Institution. So today we have our three speakers join us to give us their expertise, and I'll firstly introduce each of the speakers. So Barbara Bruckner is Global Managing Director of Climate Policy Initiative and Executive Director of its widely renowned Climate Finance Program. She was named one of the 20 most influential women in climate change. Barbara advises leaders on climate, energy, and land use investments around the world. She directs the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance and its sister programs in Brazil and India. The lab's public-private approach solicits, shapes, and tests cutting-edge climate finance instruments that resolve financing barriers hindering the alternative energy adaptation and land use projects. Instruments from the lab have mobilized over $2 billion US dollars for sustainable development in developing countries in just 5 years. She is also the lead author on Climate Policy Initiative's Global Landscape of Climate Finance, which has set the benchmark for climate finance tracking. She's on the advisory board of the BCFN Foundation, the evaluation board of the World Economic Forum Sustainable Energy Innovation Fund, and member of the One Planet Lab. Most importantly, she is co-director of the Climate Change and Energy Program in CAMA. Our second speaker will be Frank Yotzo. He's a professor at the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy, where he directs the Center for Climate and Energy Policy. He's an environmental economist. His research focuses on policy for climate change and energy in the context of economic reform and development. Frank is joint editor-in-chief of the journal Climate Policy and a lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 5th and 6th assessment reports. Professor Frank Yotzo leads work on recovery from the COVID-induced economic slump. The focus of his work is on opportunities for low-carbon investment in Australia's energy, industry, transport and housing sectors, including through government stimulus packages. He and his team also analyse trends in energy use and emissions and in private sector investment and trends in government policy and investment responses around the world. Frank is also a member of the Climate Change and Energy Program in CAMA. Adele Morris is a Senior Fellow and Policy Director for Climate and Energy Economics at the Brookings Institution. Her research informs critical decisions related to climate change, energy and tax policy. She is a leading global expert on the design of carbon pricing policies. She joined Brookings in July 2008 from the Joint Economic Committee of the US Congress, where she advised members and staff on economic, energy, and environmental policy. Before her work in Congress, she was the lead natural resource economist for the US Treasury Department for 9 years. In that position, she informed and represented Treasury's positions on agriculture, energy, climate, and radio spectrum policies. On assignment to the US Department of State in 2000, she led negotiations on land use and forestry issues in the International Climate Change Treaty process. Prior to joining the Treasury, she served as a senior economist for environmental affairs at the President's Council of Economic Advisers during the development of the Kyoto Protocol. Her career began at the Office of Management and Budget, where she oversaw rulemaking by agriculture and natural resource agencies. Adele is also a member of the Climate Change and Energy Program in CAMA. So each speaker will have about 10 minutes for opening remarks, and then we'll open to the audience for discussion. If you'd like to ask a question, there are several ways to do so. The first is by using the Q&A function on Zoom that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. So type your question into that box. You can also see questions that others have asked. If there is a question that you particularly like, use the thumbs up symbol to upvote the question, and we will pose that question to the panelist. If you would like to ask a question on the video, pose your question and please let us know in the question that you would like to ask on camera. But before we begin, I'd like to let you know that we are recording this session, which will be available on the CAMA webpage after the event. As this is a webinar, you can't be seen in the footage unless I ask you to turn on your camera. So I will now ask Barbara, our first speaker, to begin her remarks.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rami. It's a true pleasure being here with you and the other friends and colleagues on this webinar. Again, my name is Barbara Bruckner. I lead an advisory and analytic organization called Climate Policy Initiative. We work with governments, with financial institutions, and with businesses to drive economic growth while addressing climate change. We're known for tracking sustainable investment trends, for identifying innovative business models, and for supporting the solutions that can drive a transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. And most importantly, as you have already flagged here, together with Warwick Kibben, I'm delighted to be a co-director of the CAMA's Climate Change and Energy Program, and it's fantastic to finally being more active and like being able to more visible here at CAMA through this webinar here. So let's get started and just give you a little bit of my perspectives and what I've learned over the last few months on how we can really achieve these dual goals of a green recovery and of ambitious climate action, and what are the opportunities and the specific levers that I feel need to be pulled in order to really make some progress. The COVID crisis is a wake-up call for our social and for our financial systems to be better prepared for the climate crisis, which will be bigger in every way and will stay with us for a much longer time period and then the COVID crisis. Unfortunately, in fact, the threat of climate change and the threat that the climate change itself poses to the stability of our societies and our economies, that will remain, and it will particularly remain for the most vulnerable people. So in order to build back stronger after COVID-19, we need to respond as an international community, and we need to do that in a manner that lays the foundations for long-term green, resilient, and inclusive growth. And I strongly believe that finance is the cornerstone for making this happen. In fact, a sustained green, resilient recovery from COVID-19 requires significant investments to scale and achieve economy-wide transformation, particularly, again, in developing and emerging markets. But the opportunity is here. Globally, low-carbon growth could deliver economic benefits of up to $26 trillion up to 2030, and this is a conservative estimate. And stimulus measures built on climate action, for example, through renewables, they can create jobs, they can boost GDP, they can cut emissions and expand energy access, and they can really lay the foundation for healthy, inclusive, long-term prosperity. The question is how. So as governments globally roll out plans and cash for economic stimulus and for enhancing social safety nets, we need to ensure that these actions are also consistent with addressing climate change. Mainstreaming climate action into regular decision-making is the need of the day. And let me focus on 4 elements that I feel will bring us there, with a little focus on the first one, because I think it's a really critical one. So the first element are green fiscal policies. Green fiscal policies are really key to resourcing a sustainable and resilient recovery. Green fiscal policies like carbon pricing or reforming fossil fuel subsidies and green budgeting can be an important element in a government's COVID-19 response toolkit. Such approaches support countries in removing inefficiencies in public expenditures and raising additional revenues, which can be directed towards immediate relief measures while supporting medium to long-term sustainable recovery planning aligned with climate objectives. The current low oil price and the need to rebuild fiscal positions make carbon taxes and eliminating fossil fuel subsidies particularly opportune. For many countries, a $75 per ton of carbon tax would increase pump prices by less than the recent collapse in global oil prices, and could be combined with other measures like rebates or energy efficiency improvements or smart communication or assistance for low income and vulnerable households and communities. In addition to these ideas, innovative thinking must also be welcomed into fiscal policy for larger scale deployment of public finance for low carbon resilient recovery. So perhaps some governments can take advantage of the likely permanent decline in the price of oil and eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, and then use the savings to essentially pay back a recovery bond that can provide significant funding now to enhance social safety nets or accelerate the retirement of coal plants or upgrade efficiency and resiliency of buildings. In addition to that, perhaps governments could also look into debt for climate swaps or debt for climate conversions, as they're called, that can enable developing countries to utilize proceeds from reduced external debt to finance national climate adaptation and mitigation plans, and put policies in place that really can accelerate a resilient net zero transition into the future. The second element that I'd like to draw your attention to is the need for an enhanced role of development finance. Today, the majority of global public climate finance is raised, managed, and distributed by development finance institutions. Development finance, in fact, is key to both amplifying and deploying the investments needed for a green recovery in developing countries. Why? Because development banks and international finance institutions can help build strategy and support policy development. They can deploy a wide range of instruments to manage, share, and reduce risk. And they also can convene the relevant stakeholders and decision makers across the public and private sectors. And through all these activities, they can greatly enhance what the private sector can do. So there is a need to expand the ability of development banks and international financial institutions, as it's by far the cheapest and least risky way of enhancing low-cost finance. So we need to see innovation, how the public financial institutions themselves do business in order to catalyze more investment. What can they change at the strategic level of their institutions in terms of incentives, in terms of targets, to really increase their focus on the most transformative approaches? And how can they work more closely with governments to improve their enabling environments? And we also need to make sure that the crisis toolbox of instruments and the ability of such institutions to take higher levels of risks is in fact sticky, so that the development and climate action go hand in hand and are not just a little kind of episode in their performance. Third element I'd like to raise is that we need to improve the toolbox itself to use public resources in a more transformative way. So we need innovative business models and financial instruments that can enable private investment at scale. And we need to speed up efforts to prepare a pipeline of shovel-ready projects that can combine climate action with the economic recovery. So one example to come up with, excuse me for this, a noise here. There's clearly something going on. Excuse me for that. But one example of how to come up with these types of solutions are public-private initiatives such as the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which CPI manages, and Renee already referred to that in her opening and introduction to me, and which is regarded as one of the most successful climate finance incubators. And it is, by the way, supported amongst other governments also by the Australian government through DFAT. The lab is a public-private initiative of experts in sustainable investments from governments, from development finance institutions, but also from investment banks, from institutional investors and other private sector institutions. The lab's goal is to unlock private investment in clean energy and climate change at scale. It finds, it develops, and it ultimately helps to support the launch of new solutions that really can tackle barriers in the market and attract actual investment. In fact, since the lab started in 2014, it has developed and launched 41 innovative financial instruments and business models that have, as Renee also already kind of alluded to, mobilized more than $2 billion for concrete projects in emerging markets. And many of these instruments combine blended finance approaches with public investors, impact investors, and institutional investors working together to overcome financing barriers. Just as one example, through the lab, we saw that results-based finance is an effective way of aligning interests, and it can be really effectively used to achieve the desired outcomes at the project level, at the company level, at the city level, regional level, but also at the country level. So one potential example, again, that could be further developed in order to look at the opportunities here, and that certainly is very relevant for these times, is the Breathe Better Bond, which has been proposed by the IFC, the International Financial Corporation, and which has been incubated by our lab. This approach helps cities address air pollution, which is one known enhancer for COVID morbidities, by providing funding to really help reduce the cost of capital as an effective way of achieving multiple objectives, both air pollution, but also climate action. But let me move to my last element, the element 4, what I feel needs to happen in order to really have a successful recovery. And that is, we need a shift in the financial system. Coming back to my earlier mainstreaming point, ultimately all financial institutions need to align their portfolios with an inclusive, sustainable and resilient future, and climate needs to be taken into account in every financial decision. The entire financial system needs to better respond to and help reduce and manage both physical and transition risks triggered by climate change. And at the heart of this work is comprehensive reporting on climate risks and moving towards standardized mandatory disclosure, moving towards improved risk management, and a better capacity within the financial industry. So transparency and better data and tools to measure and analyze the data are key. Ultimately, what you can measure, you can't manage. So to sum up, we need systemic solutions. We are at the moment just seeing the tipping point of the iceberg of what's needed, but we need to go beyond the incremental. We need to go beyond the niche of climate finance. We need really to go towards mainstream. And so in order to get these systemic solutions, I believe that there's three areas where we need to do more work. First, innovation. Again, innovation in policies, in regulatory frameworks, in institutions, in instruments and business models. It's time to think outside of the box and come up with disruptive, innovative approaches that really can help achieve the dual goals of climate action and economic recovery. Second, global cooperation, unprecedented collaboration, moving away from the siloed approach to really solving multiple problems with one approach. And third, of course, finance. I believe we have a window to rebuild our world for a more inclusive and more resilient or more sustainable future. We have an opportunity to really mainstream climate considerations into the entire finance ecosystem, targeting both short-term economic recovery and long-term structural changes aligned with sustainable inclusive growth and aligned with strengthening society's resilience. Not doing so would pose a significant threat to the sustainable recovery and risk propagating future systemic shocks brought about by the impacts of the climate crisis. I believe that the science, that the research, and again, Kama has been at the forefront of that, have a key role of helping make progress on the three levers that I mentioned. And I look forward to discussing more of that. And thanks so much for attention. And
Hi, I guess it's my turn. Frank Jotzo here. Hello. I'll connect to the point that Barbara made on the shovel-ready projects that can assist with climate change, right? So, of course, you know, we're in this situation where many governments are moving from the immediate assistance through, for example, wage subsidies and business continuity subsidies, to a regime where we will see direct investments by government to stimulate economic activity, and that could potentially happen at very large scale. So we're seeing these packages being prepared in the European Union at really at scale and with a significant green component to them. That discussion is well and truly live, as probably you all know, right? In the sort of research and low carbon and climate change university research think tank scene. In fact, you know, there's the dream of building back better in a low carbon way. Now, you know, there's every reason to be somewhat pessimistic that this kind of dream will be achieved everywhere. China, for example, you know, I mean, what we're seeing there is a rhetoric about modern green low carbon investment, and the reality is that a lot of coal-fired power generating capacity has got the nod just earlier on this year. So what we've done here together with colleagues at Crawford School, Tom Long, who works with us on a program on renewable energy-based export opportunities, and Ziba Anjum, who's doing her PhD with us, we've taken stock of approaches to identifying fiscal stimulus options that are compatible with low carbon ambition, in particular in the infrastructure space. And yeah, there's a working paper on this just out. So obviously objectives, right? So jobs. The Australian federal government says those are the objectives for its own stimulus spending: jobs, and jobs. And so obviously that needs to happen relatively quickly to be effective, and it needs to happen in the right labor market segments. I mean, this recession is quite unusual, I would say, in that you have this very disproportionate element of unemployment and underemployment in the sort of public-facing services sector in particular, and that poses particular challenges to economic stimulus packages also. And obviously, right, objectives, longer-term economic benefits, right? So you don't want to do the old sort of cliche Keynesian thing of digging holes just to have them filled in by someone else. Again, you want long-term productivity benefits. You want to perhaps take the opportunity for some industry policy if the government were so inclined, and obviously you want those long-term transformational benefits, in particular for low carbon. So first of all, you want to avoid locking into high carbon infrastructure as you invest as a government, and you want to facilitate transition to low carbon structures. And there's, you know, in certain instances, there's also local environmental benefits to be had along the way. Thirdly, fourthly, social benefits. There's often tremendous opportunities here to create social benefits beyond the jobs, in particular in energy efficiency investments, benefits in particular to low income households and to disadvantaged regions. Now, one point that we make in the paper, and I hope quite clearly, is about process. So there needs to be clarity of objectives. There needs to be systematic analysis of how stimulus options relate to those objectives, and there needs to be transparency in how these decisions are made. That's what we're saying. That's what I would say as a taxpayer, and that is what I certainly do not observe in the Australian context, both at the federal and the state level at this point. I should perhaps qualify that by saying that the subnational jurisdictions of New South Wales and Victoria, in Australia at least, have released a list of criteria that their own stimulus spending should comply with, but that assessment of stimulus investments that are being announced against those criteria is not really forthcoming. At the federal level in Australia, there really hasn't been an explanation as to how the spending that has been announced relates to any kind of criteria or objectives. When you go through the literature, and we've done that relatively extensively, the very recent literature on green stimulus or stimulus overall this year, and then also looking back to the 2009 recession, then there's a number of criteria that you can identify from that literature. We've boiled it down to 9: employment, economic growth, timeliness of the options to shovel readiness, the implementation risk, right? So there's certainly a scale from risky to tried and proven, low carbon compatibility, local environmental benefits, social benefits, resilience. So, you know, can it withstand a resurgence of the pandemic, and governance aspects? So when you assess broad classes of stimulus investment options against these criteria, then in the Australian context, 4 groups or classes of investment options stand out as potentially very well performing against a range of these criteria, not necessarily all of them. First is to expand renewable energy supply. In Australia, we've had a tremendous boom in investment in wind and solar power. That in the last 3 years, highest per capita investment rates anywhere among the larger countries. That investment boom is clearly tailing off, and there's every risk that with the coming recession, it'll tail off even more. Clear opportunity for governments to jump in here, because there's really very little doubt that these kinds of investments will be needed and will be economically beneficial in decades to come. So you might as well fill the gap through government investment. Secondly, energy efficiency in buildings, in particular government-owned buildings and public housing. So huge opportunity for better energy efficiency. Most of that actually economically completely sensible before you think of such things as greenhouse gas emissions. Large underinvestment really in energy efficiency, and really large social benefits that can be had from that by lowering the ongoing energy bills for low-income households in particular. Most of Australia's infrastructure pipelines actually transport projects. There's a very handy priority list that's compiled by an independent body called Infrastructure Australia. Of these transport projects, some are suitable, some aren't. By going through that list, one thing that strikes you really is that smaller scale transport infrastructure options perform really well against these criteria, such as things like enhanced opportunities for active transport, walking, cycling, local transport infrastructure, because it's quick to do and not to the delays that are usually inherent in major projects. And finally, and I'll just about end on that, land management and ecological restoration. So we've had these massive bushfires, forest fires in Australia just this past summer that have left large tracts of land in need of rehabilitation. And that would strike you as a great and ready opportunity for governments to invest for the long term, for not just for ecological benefit, but also for tourism benefit, and where this kind of business and job opportunity would be created in regions that are economically weak usually, and where unemployment rates are typically disproportionate. So thanks very much for the opportunity. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you, Barbara and Frank, for a good discussion so far. And thanks to Renee and Kama for inviting me to be part of this, this excellent webinar. So I'm going to speak maybe a little bit more from the US perspective, but I think a lot of the principles that Frank and Barbara outlined apply in the US just as they would anywhere. When we think about stimulus, I think it's kind of on a spectrum. There's the immediate stimulus given the sharp declines in economic activity. And then there's kind of a spectrum where you start talking about longer term recovery investments. And so when we say green stimulus, you know, we have to be careful to, you know, be specific about what we think makes sense on which different time frames. In a nutshell, you know, Frank laid out some excellent criteria. The typical way we describe this is timely, targeted, and temporary, right? You want the stimulus to be deployed when the output gap is largest, meaning the difference between the output and economic activity that we see now versus what the economy could produce if all of its inputs were deployed, including workers in the workforce. So you want something that can be done promptly. You want it targeted because, you know, that macro multiplier that we're talking about differs across different kinds of investments, and you want to target activities and programs that are going to address the sectors with the worst job losses, right? And you want a sort of spatial consideration about this too, because like in the United States, the unemployment rate varies from like the May 2020 rate was 5.2% in Nebraska, but 25% in Nevada. And that has to do directly with the sectoral composition of those local economies. So you want timely, targeted, and you want temporary, because this which is largely going to be fueled by debt spending, you can't expect that to continue indefinitely. So you want to have some sense of what the right time horizon is to unwind this kind of deficit spending, and you don't want to go overboard. And then I think what we're talking about here is adding a new T word, which I'll call transitional. And this is meaning stimulus and recovery spending that is supportive of a transition to a low carbon economy and to a hotter, disrupted climate. And so there we're looking for this intersection of the timely, targeted, temporary investments and spending and federal activity, but then that's intersection with climate related goals. And so those are in its own different categories. You've got your mitigation of emissions, your adaptation and resilience. So you want to reduce the damages from a given level of greenhouse gas concentrations. And then you've got a whole other host of potential activities relating to research and development that really try to lower the marginal abatement cost of emissions and lower the marginal costs of adaptation and resilience. So we're looking for that intersection. Now, the challenge to me is if we're going to do something that's climate related and it's going to have environmental and economic benefits, it's important to know that we might be incurring the opportunity cost of something that is actually more stimulating to the economy, right? So if we're going to compromise on the stimulus value, of these investments, then the environmental and other benefits should be worth it. And given how bad this recession is, I kind of think it behooves us to hold this to a relatively high bar. I don't think we should just say, hey, you know, the economy's gone to hell. This is a good time to, you know, do whatever spending we sort of already had on our long list of agenda items. I think given our circumstances, we have to be careful that when we compromise on stimulus and recovery, we know we're getting a good value for the public. And that is not to say, I know there's a lot to be done for climate purposes. The question is whether or not it makes sense to put it under the umbrella of stimulus and specifically to finance it with greater and greater levels of debt. And that's one problem the US has. We came into this recession with an already high debt to GDP ratio. And as a result, I think we were ill-equipped fiscally to respond to this emergency. And that was actually one reason that people, you know, in fiscal leadership under the Obama administration had made for improving our debt to GDP ratio was, hey, there could be an emergency down the line and we're not going to have the fiscal space to deal with it properly if we don't kind of get our house in order. And we obviously didn't do that. And now we're in the pickle that we're in. So stimulus can be spending, and we've sort of talked about that, but there can be other programmatic frameworks for the stimulus. We can think about, like in the direct spending department, you can have payments to households. We had a set of those. We can think about investments in infrastructure, and we've talked about that. There can be all sorts of other things, though. I will say that some of these vehicles for stimulus are easier than others. And you might think payments to households would be super easy because all you have to do is send checks. But in the US system, unfortunately, what we've seen is we kind of have fairly decrepit data systems in government, and they don't always talk to each other. So, you know, the US just gave out payments to over 1 million dead people and stuff like that. And so that doesn't exactly build confidence. But I think, you know, we do have to do a better job reaching people who don't file tax returns and who don't have bank accounts, and finding ways to let them benefit from a stimulus that they deserve along with everybody else who qualifies. I think it's clear so far that the lowest, you know, targeting the lowest income households brings the greatest increase in consumer spending. So if we are looking for that retail spending macro multiplier, I think it's pretty key to keep our eyes set on those lowest income households who honestly have been disproportionately burdened. Now we could say, all right, well, it should be tax credits, but I think tax credits may work in some instances, but it's not clear. If you're in a situation where profits are negative and tax liabilities are low, unless your tax credit's refundable, I'm not sure that's the most stimulative vehicle. There's loan guarantees, but loans, you know, add to commercial debt, and and they require payback, and so they're only going to be interested in positive returns on investment. And unless the loans are forgivable, which is like one of the big debate points around our Small Business Administration loans, you know, loan guarantees may not actually work very well. Now, there's another line of stimulus that people talk about, and I think this should be on the radar of people who are concerned about environmental measures. And this is the idea that stimulus should be in the form of deregulation, including rolling back environmental regulations under the assertion that these things are burdensome to the economy. I think the vast majority of those ideas are ill-advised, and if deregulation didn't make sense before the pandemic, it's not going to make sense now. And so, you know, most of those rules are providing important health and environmental benefits, so we don't really want to go there, but it's worth having on one's radar. So a lot of the investments that might be made for climate mitigation kind of don't line up perfectly for the conditions we have now. And I'll give you some examples. So what do we need for climate? We need to retool the power sector so that it's decarbonized. That's one of the most cost-effective things we can do. But that means building out new electricity capacity. Well, we don't need new electricity capacity because demand for electricity is down substantially. What we should be doing is retiring coal-fired power plants early, right? But then that's arguably kind of destimulating, right? Because you're shutting down activity that, you know, employs people and keeps the coal industry going. So there's some tension there between what's actually going on in the dynamics of the power sector versus what could actually be stimulating. So in fact, like the coal industry's been lobbying for a reduction in the taxes they pay for the Black Lung Liability Trust Fund, which is a very small tax on much of the coal mined in the United States. And they're looking for subsidies and relief from their obligations. And I think it's going to be a challenge just to beat back the demands for those kinds of measures, much less add new burdens on the coal sector and other, you know, oil and gas sectors right now. Not that we shouldn't be doing that for climate purposes, but it's just coming at a time where those industries already feel like they've been kicked in the teeth. Another challenge, I think, is that the sectors that are going to be most critical to the climate transition are going to be, you know, construction and engineering and professional services. Some of those are not the industries that are most hard hit by the current recession, where we're talking about leisure and hospitality, some professional services, but we're talking about travel and retail and even state and local government. So trying to find the match between the industries and sectors that we need for the climate investment and the sectors that are hardest hit by the pandemic and resulting economic problems, that's kind of a tricky intersection. And the other challenge, of course, is like we need innovation, we need R&D for climate, but I'm a little doubtful that this crisis is leaving a bunch of PhD engineers unemployed and sitting around waiting for their next project. So again, not that we don't have to do all that stuff for climate, but putting it in a stimulus bucket may not be the easiest fit. Okay, so now I'm being kind of negative. So let me talk about what I think can work. And first of all, you know, again, I want to emphasize there's a lot of investment that we need for climate, and the sooner the better. Some of the things I think that are going to be the most promising probably come under the umbrella of adaptation and resilience as opposed to emissions mitigation. But on the emissions mitigation side, I think stimulus could target some resources towards those folks in coal-reliant communities who are going to be hard hit with the demise of the coal industry, which is really almost a foregone conclusion given what we need to do on climate. So I'm working on a series of papers on this topic, looking at, you know, how do you help coal workers with health and pension benefits? Can we invest in mine reclamation? Maybe there's water quality improvements in these areas we could invest in. And of course, there's the typical workforce and community development ideas. So there's a whole host of these things that I think, you know, maybe they could start out as stimulus, but then ultimately be funded by other sources. I'm going to talk about that in a second. I also think there's probably a good opportunity to invest in new processes in industrial facilities. So there I'm thinking about primary metals and cement and some of the big energy intensive trade exposed industries that are going to be critical to decarbonization, but are also going to be vulnerable if we ever do adopt climate policy. We talked about energy efficiency a little bit already, retrofitting buildings and homes. I think the technology's gotten much better in that, and maybe this is a good time to think about upgrading commercial buildings. I think one challenge, of course, is that commercial building markets are kind of crazy right now. We don't even know what the demand for office space is going to look like in a post-COVID environment. So that kind of adds a little risk to the situation. Another example in that vein is investment in public transit. You know, right now, public transit is in dire financial condition because of low ridership, because who wants to be crammed on a big train car with other people who might be infected with the virus? So I don't know what the right approach for that would be, but we do need climate resilient infrastructure irrespective of all of that. So we need sewer systems, both storm sewers and waste sewers. We need drinking water systems, bridges and roads, coastal infrastructure, fire suppression, investments in water efficiency, all the things we need to be doing to our infrastructure to make it more resilient to a disrupted climate. And we're going to need new crop varieties and technologies and better animal agriculture and better meat alternatives. So to the extent that we could add a little stimulus to that, that would be great. I think one promising idea I've heard on the mitigation side is to invest in ensuring that abandoned oil and gas wells are not leaking methane. So that's something where you could put the workers in the oil and gas sector back to work in a way that could provide some serious climate benefits. So I want to conclude with one additional idea. And okay, so the Venn diagram is already kind of tough because we got this fairly narrow intersection of climate investments and stimulus activities. But there's another timely dimension for our consideration, and that is, you know, the legitimate concerns of low-income communities and communities of color in feeling like they've been left out and feeling like they've been disproportionately burdened by environmental problems. So I welcome the research community to start thinking about what, if we're going to add another thing to the Venn diagram, what could it be through the lens of social justice? So some of the ideas I'll throw out, but I don't know necessarily what the best ideas might be, but, you know, investing in better monitoring of air and water quality in low-income communities and communities of color, funding appropriate enforcement by regulatory agencies, federal and state and local, to make sure that communities are and businesses are attaining the emission standards to which they haven't always been held. And where the standards aren't met, you know, investing in the cleanups. And that might mean rehabilitating urban industrial sites, like I said, mines, retired coal-fired power plants, especially where there's unstable coal ash deposits. And of course, you know, you want to hold the feet to the fire of those who are responsible for those cleanups. But, you know, rather than waiting for, you know, protracted legal battles to work themselves out, maybe we can go ahead and invest in some of those improvements and then collect on the debits later. And then finally, so how are we going to finance all this? So maybe in the early years, it comes out of deficit spending, but maybe we could do it such that it transitions to being funded by a carbon tax. And then what you can do is if you adjust the spending and the revenue correctly, then a program like this could be considered deficit neutral over the 10-year budget window where federal programs are usually scored. So for, you know, easing the passage of such a package, I think it's possible to make it over the span of 10 years deficit neutral while keeping the stimulus aspects of it solid in the early years. So I'm going to close there, and I welcome your questions.
Great, thank you. I'll now invite Barbara and Frank to turn their cameras back on. Just before we open to questions from the group, I was just wondering if you have any comments or questions for any of your other fellow panelists. Perhaps Barbara, would you like to start? You have your mute button on.
Oops, sure. No, I think first of all, I really enjoyed the presentations. Thanks so much, Frank and Adil, and lots of thoughts. And I think for me, the biggest, it's not really even a question, is I think a clarification to Adil also, like when I was talking about innovation, I didn't mean like R&D. I really meant like coming up with, new disruptive, approaches in, policies, in, taxes, in like different types of financial vehicles or policy vehicles that can really help to address that the recovery phase. So it's not about just like thinking about we need to give money to the R&D or kind of to come up with new technologies. It's really about finding ways that you can best use the public money now, and really finding ways that you can actually address some of the sectors that are hardest hit, and how can you come up, as you said, actually very nicely, match basically that where we have most of the issues and where we have the unemployment is the skill sets that are needed for a resilient infrastructure. And there is a backlog of investments at the moment, so there will be lots that will be happening. So just to clarify that point, and yeah, and I think that there is a number of actually examples I have from different countries where things are happening, including from the European Union, both on the EU-wide scale on the bailout package, what's happening there, but also from some of the specific member countries there, and be happy to share those in the conversation. But just to say, enjoyed all, and also couldn't agree more than this, the principles, the overall principles that Frank, that you laid out in the over, how to really come up with some good guidance. And maybe last point, just on the principles, we are just starting a project, this European Climate Foundation, where we hope actually to be involving also Brookings on coming up with this principles for sustainable recovery, and really trying to bring together the different conversations that are taking place, for how, mostly on the public side, between finance ministers, coalition between central banks, between different types of regulators as well, and what is going on in research, and really trying to come up with something that can guide governments going forward in a more, and really kind of get a bigger, hopefully, stakeholder engagement and buy-in from these different actors. And I'd love to kind of exchange more on that as well. So sorry, so no specific questions, more reflections on all the discussions here.
Well, I was just going to say to Barbara's point just now, I think she made a really good point, and I want to build on that, which is, as we roll out these various stimulus options, I think it's really important to learn as much as we can from them. So if there's I would put a premium on trying things that will help us better allocate the next tranche of dollars. And so there's some good evidence about what worked and what didn't in the stimulus of the previous recession in 2008 and 2009. But because I think, well, Jerome Powell said it today, the Fed chair, that this looks like it's going to be a longer recovery than any of us had hoped. And so to the extent that that's true, I think Barbara's point that we should learn now for what we do next, and then for what we do there after that, because we could be at this for a while, and we should endeavor to get better and better at it.
Yeah, I'd actually like to build on a point that Adele you made before, and that is the tendency for governments to support declining industries, such as, for example, the coal mining industry, right? And so we see that emerging in Australia as well. So the federal infrastructure support package announced 2 weeks ago has an expansion of a very large mine in the Australian outback, right? Without any explanation that I could find as to how that relates to objectives of creating jobs for people who have experienced unemployment in the, in the travel and hospitality industry. You can of course see it as general, stimulus, hoping for the multiplier effects and so forth. The New South Wales government, in its more local packages, has announced fast tracking of expansion of thermal coal mines, that kind of thing, right? And so, I mean, it's clear why this is happening, right? I mean, there's enormous vested interests. The coal industry is doing really tough. Coal prices are right down, okay, along with coal demand. And so, of course, those industries would be on Treasury's footsteps and demanding support as part of these packages. But I think there's a really clear argument that this is actually a fairly bad investment from a public benefit point of view, and also purely from the point of view of what you're supporting there in terms of the potential for future value added and productivity, right? And all of this is obvious. What's not obvious to me is how to most effectively provide analysis on this that has a chance to have traction in the political and bureaucratic decision-making process. So I'd be really interested in discussing perspectives on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's so tempting when you see an industry in trouble like coal to put your investments toward what will make shareholders and company executives whole. But that's not what's going to benefit the workers in the long run, right? So they're already experiencing the low carbon transition. And once the US has anything like a price on carbon or a clean electricity standard or something like that, it's going to get a lot worse for those folks in those areas. So to me, stimulus spending is an opportunity to make those folks better off than they otherwise would be, but with a focus on the workers and the communities, the folks that actually have to make the economic transition, and to some extent a social transition. It can be very disruptive. But as long as we're, thinking about deploying dollars in the, hundreds of billions, gosh, maybe we could target to some of the folks who've already been suffering, downturns in their industry, and help them craft a more promising future.
Absolutely. And just adding to that, I mean, what is different from, the last crisis is at that point, renewables weren't that competitive yet. I mean, the coal industry is already in a crisis. So, it's basically giving them now money is like really like halting or putting, basically pushing backwards a transition that was already on its way. So I think we need to find ways that we can really help accelerate this transition. I mean, if you just look at the jobs here in the US over the last, years, the highest job growth was in renewable industries, while the, compared to the jobs in coal industry, that they're really negligible. But still, I mean, we need to find ways to really come up with options for the people who work in coal industry and really show, what they can do. But I would really be very sad and very disappointed if we start kind of bailing out the coal industry now, or like making it expand even in light of what's going on. And I mean, just some of the lessons, and there's some questions, and I'll pass on to someone who has studied more the lessons of the last crisis. But I think one of the lessons from the last financial crisis was certainly, that there are ways that it's not a radical idea to try to kind of combine an acceleration of specific industries towards a more greener future. I mean, we've had the bailout of GM and Chrysler during the 2008 financial crisis, and there were attached rules requiring the production of more energy efficient fleets. And that turns out it was really kind of what was needed to make this sector that was already struggling at that point, to make it really keep up with foreign competition. So it can be good, but we see that, in France, Air France, the French government has attached to the bailout of Air France, of the aviation airline, some clear requirements to become more efficient and like have their own goals. So I think there are ways, but I really think it is really important to make sure that that is happening now, and that it's not kind of being used as an excuse to to basically almost like artificially keep alive an industry that is already in its transition.
Great, thank you. I would now like to ask Warwick McKibben also to turn on his camera. We have some questions by Warwick and also by Yeong Kai. Perhaps we'll start with you Yeong. What is your question? You need to put your mic on, whatever.
Sorry, I'm just so used to the touch screen, and I thought I'm on my iPad. Yeah. So, hello everyone, and
Hi, Yeong.
yeah, hi. And I'm a CAMA research associate, and also work for the government. And I have to say that first of all, I agree with Barbara that climate change is important, and I also agree with Adele that like there are important kind of other important questions, and there's like things that we don't know. But I also agree with Frank that like we need some criteria for like kind of different proposals that will be coming up like in the next few months or next few years. And my question is like, well, I think it's going to be a very difficult time for us and for the government. We'll be seeing a lot of different proposals, but are there any kind of tools that we can kind of have, like just to bring everything together to come up with a whole of the economy view for us to think about that? Because everyone will be saying that they have a problem. Which one has a bigger problem, and what would be the biggest bang for buck? Thanks.
Yeah. I'll be happy to quickly jump in because we've done that review recently, and really it boils down to a multi-criteria assessment, right? And the point that we can kind of identify from all of these different proposals and the experience from 2009 is that the best recipe is just to be really clear about what matters to your policy objectives, right? And then do that analysis and then come to some sort of reasonable trade-offs between those different objectives and be quite explicit about it, right? I mean, we have not seen a convincing way of, for example, monetizing or in some quantitative way balancing all of these different objectives, right? One kind of useful quantification that you see in the literature is the economic multiplier effect of different investment options. Yeah, when you actually look at empirical studies, it's really not so easy to determine this, right? But you can usually identify options that tend to do really well on economic multiplier, and others that don't tend to do well, right? And so you can you can deduce something there. It's a really interesting paper out by Cameron Hepburn and colleagues in Oxford Review of Environmental Policy. Nick Stern and Joe Stiglitz are co-authors on this. And there's some good general lessons there, but they also provide an expert survey on the perceived economic multiplier effects and the perceived speediness and one other dimension that I forget now, for broad categories of stimulus investment options. I thought that actually quite informative. Happy to share that link. It's easy to find, Hepburn et al.
Great, thank you. Warwick?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone for great presentations. It's great to see you all. I think I've been a co-author and a collaborator with everybody on the panel, and including Yeong. I guess one issue, Adele touched upon this, but I didn't think anyone really made the case. So Adele mentioned that there's a big push to do deregulation as a way of stimulating the economy. I agree with Adele's assessment that there's good deregulation and bad deregulation. But what no one has actually said is that before we get the stimulus spending, before we do anything, we have to have a very clear framework for climate policy within each country. So if you know that the Australian government has a clear path forward, then when you get the recovery, it will be moved in a direction consistent with the government plan or government projection. So I think a prerequisite for everything everybody has said is that you have to have clarity on what the climate policy is and what the energy policy is. And my question to the panel is, how important do you think it is to start with policymakers setting out what their goals are and what their framework is, and then you can decide and let the private sector then come in behind the stimulus, because the private sector don't know what to invest in the climate space while there's ambiguity. I just wonder how important is that foundation, and that should that be a core to going forwards to get clarity at the national and the supranational level on what climate policies to do. Thanks.
Well, I think it's critical work. You know, the problem we have in the United States, of course, is that Congress is immobile on this issue right now. You can see the report from yesterday's release of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, where they lay out like over 500 pages of recommended policies that are now kind of the core of the Democratic Party's platform on climate, and it covers all kinds of stuff, including all the things we've talked about today, including a price on carbon. But what of that could be passed in a scenario where you've got a Democrat in the White House and Democratic Party control in both the Senate and House? That's a wild, and I mean, I think there's huge error bars around any estimate of what U.S. climate policy is going to be. I think if we have Democratic control of, you know, federal government, there's a chance we'll get something. But I don't know if it's going to be a clean electricity standard or a carbon tax or some kind of notional goal for 2050 that we don't have any real policy instruments to do anything to achieve. So as much as I wholeheartedly agree that it's critical to have some policy that's going to steer these investments in a way that makes sense, given what our policy future is going to be. Right now, I think it's anybody's guess what it's going to be. And if we have a re-election of President Trump, it might not be anything for another 4 years, which is a terrible thought. So, you know, I don't know that there's anything you can do about it right now. I welcome your suggestion. When are the Australians going to interfere in our election work and help us elect somebody who can take some action?
Does anyone else want to?
I was going to comment, yes, they already are. It's called Rupert Murdoch.
Yes, yes, yes.
He's an American though now, isn't he? I wanted to say, look, on the point of policy, absolutely, right? What do you want? You want investment, 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 right? And ideally private sector investment, yes. And, you know, I mean, what we've heard is certainly from the Australian energy industry, including international investors in the Australian energy sector, is that policy uncertainty has been their major roadblock, the major thing holding them back for a long time now, right? As regards renewable energy investment, that increasingly is actually not so much policy uncertainty, but regulatory and market design uncertainty, right? Because there's doubts as to whether the existing energy market, electricity market, which is to a fair extent based on a spot market, based on marginal cost, right? Whether that will actually be able to deliver the revenues that are needed to run a zero marginal cost kind of system of the future. And that needs to be sorted out. And once we've got a credible system of pricing electricity supply, right, that looks like it'll be in place for the 2030s and 2040s, right, you would expect that a lot of private investment will be forthcoming. So yes, right, if that Gordian knot could be cut, right, you could be, you know, that's the equivalent of many, many billions of public investment, really. I'm not at all hopeful that, you know, that even this kind of really extraordinary situation will allow the various governments involved, because this is a federal and state government thing, to get there quickly. But yeah, I mean, the argument to actually really tackle this and tackle it quickly is much stronger than before this crisis, I think.
I think I'm just adding as well, and I think more of a great question, really. And I think, again, I think policy is key. I mean, just looking at the work we do on tracking climate finance since now almost 10 years, what we've seen is that almost, 3/4 from the overall climate finance flows that we can identify, that we can trace, they're actually domestic, which means they're spent, raised and spent in the same country. And that shows, again, really this importance of, the stable policy environment, the stable regulatory environment. And I think it's even stronger so for the private sector. So certainly having that in place, I think is key. And I think what we see also, I think I'm with Frank in saying it's like not not only kind of coming up with a clear plan for you know, a government and targets and, you know, where do you go. I think it's in parallel. This really kind of what I meant is like how to shift the whole financial ecosystem. I think you need really to come up with, I think there is, if you look at private capital, if you talk to corporates, there's just this perception that there is not enough urgency there. So there is not enough public support, there is not enough signals, they're not sufficiently incentivized. There's moral hazards because there are some false safety nets by governments, like, you know, supporting still fossil fuels, but also climate-related frameworks are not integrated in the financial system. So there's a weak regulatory framework. There's no mandatory disclosure of some of these things. So I think it's really, I think it goes, you know, two ways. You got to come up with the real climate policies of on a national level, but in parallel, you got to really work on kind of revolutionizing in a way this whole financial ecosystem. And I think, again, like working a lot with the COP26 presidency, and there, you know, there's both parts. So there's on one hand, there is this goal of the presidency to make sure that there is enhanced or like climate action by the various countries. So they're really trying to make, you know, more ambitious nationally determined contributions on the country level. But in parallel, there's Mark Carney, who is trying to come up with like really kind of making basically every financial decision consider climate, and so working with the different ways and coalitions to really work on more that kind of financial system side. So I think you need both to really make progress, but I do believe that it really goes hand in hand in then enabling basically a green recovery and really fostering also particularly the private sector to come in at the larger scale. And again, there will be quite a bit of investments coming from the private sector as well. Certainly the backlog, particularly on the resilient infrastructure side. But yeah, let me stop here.
Thank you. We have one question that's come through on the Q&A by Thomas London, which I believe is Frank's co-author, perhaps. And that question is, what were some of the lessons from the global financial crisis that we haven't learned? Are we making the same mistakes as we did in the past? He has examples from Australia and China in mind. Does anyone want to take on that?
I know there's a literature on this. It's just not a literature I know very well. So I'm gonna punt to somebody else who knows that better than I do.
Well, I can actually, I'm not on the panel, but one of the key things I think, and it's already been raised, I think Barbara or Adele, and that is the idea of allowing zombie industries to form, that you don't let the system clean out those industries that don't have a future. That is the key challenge, and that's a mistake we've seen with the central bank interventions for the last decade. Too many industries that should have died didn't die, and the ones that stayed have dragged down global productivity. So that's a key one, that we have to work out how to transition. And if we don't get that right, the recovery is going to be a very slow recovery.
And we have another question by Sawal Jabri, who would like to convey that she enjoys this interesting topic, and they wonder how this might be applicable to developing countries.
Yeah, I would just very briefly, I think very much in the same way, except that usually fiscal capacity will be more constrained. So there'll probably be less money thrown around, which you could say makes it even more important to make really good choices about what that tight fiscal space is invested in. Right? But I think in general, really the criteria, objectives and approaches are quite similar. And, you know, I love the point Warwick made about, you know, not creating zombie industries, all the more important in fast growing economies, right? Where you actually have all of that opportunity to, if you're going to help someone out, help out those that are actually viable in the long term and that will be growing.
I would just say that for developing countries that are still building their infrastructure in many dimensions and their built environment and their cities, it's really important not to invest in those things in a way that's not resilient to a low carbon future and not resilient to a disrupted climate. So this is not the time to be building coal-fired power plants. It's not the time to be building buildings in low-lying areas that are very vulnerable to sea level rise, it's important to kind of keep in mind not just the past climate, but the future climate as developing countries, grow their economies. I think it's difficult to do that analytically if you don't have the experience rating of the future climate, but there are ways to handle that, and it should be part of perhaps the strings that are attached to international finance to make sure that those investments are going to pay off in the new climate.
So we have one final question, and I also think this is a question that I've had in my mind as well. And that is from Golkanos. A key difference between the current and the previous crises is that there's already been a substantial amount of spending in the form of salary payments for lockdown workers, pushing debt to GDP to record levels in most countries, and hence competition across further spending categories that will be intense. Given that it takes longer for green investment to yield returns, how confident are you that governments will commit to climate-friendly spending?
Just one initial point, it does not take longer for green investment to yield returns, particularly on the renewable energy side. This is like a myth. We are like fast, beyond that. We have really solar, onshore wind. These are investments that are actually competitive today with other more traditional fossil fuel industries. So I think we really got to understand, which are the investments that actually yield returns, and particularly if you're take into account that the various co-benefits that we've also discussed today, it's not only really trying to see how you create local, employment, but what are ways of really addressing some of the issues. So just and I know the others will have some certainly more understanding on how confident you are on specific governments, but I think we got to really change the narrative and really reframe this as an opportunity for governments to look at certain sectors, and again, not all of them, but I think there are a number of real opportunities, and we are actually seeing that from a number of countries already. Again, European Union, 750 billion euro recovery package, 25% of that is linked to green investment. So that is a very strong decision there. And there's a number of other countries, or also developing countries, who are doing things like that. But I think it really takes, we gotta kind of be much better in telling, showcasing the opportunity, but also being more transparent and have more work, like also Frank on that deal, and Warwick and Renee, you're doing on what are the implications, so that there are no ways for also politicians to basically change change the story again and used as an excuse. But let me hand over to others.
I'll be happy to quickly jump in. So yeah, I would agree. So it's generally not an issue of returns on investment, or even the timing of the returns of investment. What can be an issue is with regard to timing, right? And the question is, how quickly can you start up that project investment, right? And so I think what we see is a bias towards older existing industries that simply in part comes from the fact that the installations are already there, and an expansion, for example, of an existing mine, right, tends to be done more quickly than starting up a greenfield investment in large-scale renewable energy production, right? So that's when you think about timing, right, what can you get done quickly? And so it's obviously important to scour the portfolio of investment options in low-carbon, future-proof things, right, for those kinds of options that can be started immediately, right? And so that actually does come back to a bit of a clean out in terms of regulatory processes, right? And so, I mean, I can see some tentative signs of progress here in Australia on that, right? Because very large scale opportunities for wind and solar parks have been identified in the gigawatt scale, right? And they normally take years and years and years just in the approval process. And there are steps to speed up those approvals, because it's really pretty clear where they should go and that they will happen.
Well, great. So thank you. I think that we will bring the session to a close. It's so great to see such wonderful in-depth ideas that you all have obviously been working on for a really, really long time, and hopefully given the circumstances that we're in, we're able to actually implement some of them. So it's been a pleasure to spend the last hour or so with our panelists. So I would especially like to thank our speakers and attendees who are not necessarily in a convenient time zone for staying connected with us. Our next event will be next week. We have a seminar by Enrique Martinez Garcia from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas on checking the path towards recovery from the COVID-19 response. And then the following week, we have a panel on data and data science in the face of COVID-19, where we have David Gurley, the Chief Statistician for Australia, Anthony Goldbloom, the co-founder or the founder of Kaggle, the world's largest machine learning data organization, as well as Tara Sinclair from GW. So we can't hear you at home, but now would be the time where we would all please thank our speakers with a round of applause. So I hope you will do so at home, because the world needs good karma. So thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
And Frank.
Thanks. Great to be with you all.
It's nice to see you too.